Good evening and welcome to Blueprint Explosive Exclusive. I'm Madhavdas G. There's a stunning and significant turn in the India-Canada face-off. 3 years after linking India to the killing of Khalistani separatist Hardeep Singh Nijjar, Canada has now taken a U-turn. Canada's police chief has made a big admission that there's no current evidence of India-linked covert operations on Canadian soil. He said that there are no longer clandestine activities or transnational repression taking place in Canada that are linked to the Indian government. His comments came following months of diplomatic tension between India and Canada. Remember how India was publicly named, diplomats were targeted, and a global narrative was built blaming our country for covert operations in Canada. But now, that very narrative appears to be crumbling. Let me take you through how all of this began. Now, Trudeau had alleged India's role in Nijjar's murder in September of 2023. He had made a statement in his parliament at that point of time when he was Prime Minister. India has dismissed the claims in September 2023 itself, and India had suspended issuing new visas for Canadians also in the year September 2023. Canada then announced withdrawal of 41 diplomats in October 2023. US then charged an Indian national for Panoon's murder. And this was, of course, the plot was unearthed in the year 2023 in the month of November. MEA then formed a committee to inspect US claims again in the same month of November of 2023. There was an Indian national later arrested for Nijjar's killing. This was in May 2024, and Canada deemed Indian diplomats persons of interest in October 2024. India later expelled Canadian diplomats in October of 2024, and later Justin Trudeau resigned from the post of Prime Minister in January of 2024. Mark Carney later took over as Prime Minister of Canada in March 2024, and of course the difference in the diplomatic ties is there for all to see. But did Trudeau have any evidence at all to back his claims? No, because in 2024 he revealed that his government had no concrete evidence when it initially accused India of being involved in the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Listen in.
Over the course of the summer, I was apprised by my intelligence services that there was credible intelligence that agents of the government of India were involved in the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar.
Now look at the Trudeau-era blunders, the claims, the controversies and the missteps that shook India-Canada relations. Here's what went wrong. Blunder 1, no proof, blamed India for Nijjar's killing. Blunder 2, admitted feeding anti-India info to the United States, in fact, paper. The third blunder is that they put Indian officials under audio and video surveillance. The fourth, admitted to no hard proof linking India to Nijjar's killing. Blunder 5, Trudeau turned a blind eye to India's concerns in relation to Khalistan and the extremely offensive and at times even violent protests that were taking place. Now, his claims of criminal activity by Indian agents, threats to Canadian security, and even the so-called Bishnoi gang working with Delhi were all ultimately proved baseless. But the so-called K propaganda eventually crumbled and Canada did a U-turn. Authorities walked back the claim, stating that there was no evidence of India-linked violent activity. The shoot and scoot strategy has been exposed, and Trudeau had publicly blamed India even before investigations had concluded. The Trudeau government's stance on Khalistani elements had triggered the India-Canada fallout. Under Mark Carney, Ottawa has shifted to a more cautious approach. Critics say that domestic vote bank pressures had influenced Trudeau's policies. Meanwhile, New Delhi stood vindicated, having consistently rejected the allegations that were coming in from Canada, with none other than a Canadian top cop giving a clean sheet to India. Let's take this across to our guest. Joining us with us is Veena Sikri, former High Commissioner of India to Bangladesh. We also have with us Ruchi Wali, who's a community leader from the Indo-Canadian community. Joining us also is Dean Baxendale, international publisher and columnist at the Sunday Guardian. We have Terry Milewski, senior Canadian journalist, joining us. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Veena Sikri, it's very, very significant because, here you have a set of charges that were put out in the public domain without any concrete evidence, and now the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is saying as much. And what's even more shocking is that the kind of diplomatic actions that were taken, ties between the two countries that were put to risk, given the kind of allegations that were there, clearly Justin Trudeau was playing a very high-risk game And at stake were the ties between India and Canada. And that's now clearly proved from the statement of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
Yes, absolutely. I still remember the time when Prime Minister Trudeau, former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, made the statement in the Canadian Parliament talking about credible allegations. And actually, everybody was shocked because what is this category called credible allegations? You can have credible evidence, you can say they are allegations and we are investigating them. Nothing of the kind. And there was no proof at any stage. India was very restrained in its response and said we are prepared to look into any evidence, any proof of the allegations that are being made, but we will not accept any of this, very generalized, fake, so-called credible allegations. And India maintained its course very steadily and said we are interested in India-Canadian relations stepping up, and there's a lot of potential that has to be developed. But because of the internal concern, the political alliance that former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had with the pro-Khalistani group, that it never went away. He just kept on getting worse and worse into the quagmire of allegations which had no proof at all. And in the end, I think the people of Canada realized that this is something that is affecting relations and affecting internal situation within Canada, with the pro-Khalistani group getting more and more, vengeful and active. And I think the turnaround came when Prime Minister Trudeau was forced to resign, and under Prime Minister Mark Carney, there's been a complete reset in the relationship, and we've had very good meetings between Prime Minister Carney and Prime Minister Modi, and with Prime Minister Carney's recent visit to India, the strategic cooperation that has been agreed upon, the energy and critical minerals agreement, the technology and security agreement, the education, the trade agreement, and these have all set an entirely new page.
Okay.
We've sort of back completely on the previous allegations and gone into a new...
Let me bring in a counterpoint. Yeah, let me bring in a counterpoint. Dean Baxendale, the very fact that there was a credible allegation, if there's an oxymoron that I've heard that is the strangest in my life, it's got to be that. What on earth is a credible allegation was a question that we were asking here in India. And now that's exactly been proved to be right. What was Trudeau thinking even when he put out this charge without having an iota of evidence?
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me on once again. I think that, we go back to that day when he made the statement in Parliament, and we look back to the pressure he was under based on Chinese foreign interference in Canada. The Prime Minister was trying to look prime ministerial and ultimately tried to deflect from the situation from China, foreign interference, which there is significant foreign interference happening in our country, and transnational repression. And the Indian allegations, obviously very complex, and the fact that the RCMP and CSIS, who had informed multiple governments on the Khalistani threat in Canada and fundraising and funding terrorist operations and disruption operations in India, were ignored forever. What's most disturbing, though, about the statement from the commissioner is the fact that he said he sees no dots, can connect no governments to transnational repression in Canada on all the files. This is a misstatement, and he is jeopardizing diaspora communities writ large inside Canada. Foreign interference is happening, whether or not the Indian government is engaged with it or not. In this case, it remains to be seen.
Well, the police certainly haven't found any evidence, and if there was any, I'm sure 3 years is a long enough time for them to have at least found some shreds or indications of those evidence. But this is a serious issue. As you rightly said, there's a huge Indian community. Let me bring in the other panelists, please. Ruchi Wali is also with us, and she's an Indian community leader from the Indo-Canadian community. And Ruchi Wali, this is a very real fear, because what ends up happening is that this vocal minority, if one can call it that, or this violent group, who go around as Khalistanis, but just look at the incidents of violence that they've been engaged in. They were given an absolute free run due to whatever political concerns that Mr. Trudeau had, whether it was his vote banks, whatever, so on and so forth. But the point is, at the risk of pleasing those individuals, he ended up, wrecking the ties with India and, of course, impacting on Indo-Canadians, particularly those living there in Canada. Ruchi Wali.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, Shivam. Thank you for having me here. It's good to share the panel with Terry Molesky. Well, I want to take a little bit dig on the history here. So the bitterness between the relationship between India and Canada is not just from Trudeau's era. So it's at least 40 years old, since we had the Air India bombing. The relationship has been bitter. And what you will notice is that there is a certain group of people, these Khalistani people, and also some organizations like WSO, who have played a significant part in ensuring that the Khalistani extremism or the Khalistani terrorism is not being highlighted, or it does not become a state policy. So back in the day, I think in 2028, after the Air India trial, we were in the inquiry, and that is when they started coming up with this conspiracy theory that India is behind, bringing down their own national airline when there was no evidence at all. And if you would remember, when our Prime Minister visited India last in 2018, and that time one of the Khalistani terrorists, Jaspal Atwal, he showed up in one of the dinners and other engagements for the previous Prime Minister. And that is when the conservatives they tried to bring a motion, and they tried to highlight federal conservatives. They tried to bring a motion in the federal parliament to highlight the Khalistani extremism, but it was WSO who came after them. Then liberals, they tried the same thing. So it has always been that element that has been ensuring that Canada and India do not have a good relationship when we are two thriving democracies, and we should have a good relationship.
Absolutely.
And yes, it
and it's about
impacts
people-to-people contact as well, which is so significant in this particular case. But Terry Milewski, would you like to respond to that? Was Trudeau, for his own domestic political concerns as a Prime Minister, as a politician, sacrificing at the altar relations of Canada with India, as the previous speaker Ruchi was mentioning? Do you agree with her analysis?
Yes, as it turned out, he certainly was jeopardizing Canada's standing vis-a-vis India, and the rest is history. As you've correctly laid out, the expulsion of diplomats, tit for tat, and the rest of it. But both parties are now trying to get past that, even if it's not pretty. I mean, there were activities going on which disturbed the Canadians deeply, and other activities on the Canadian side which disturbed the Indians. What I mean is that Canada was tolerating and even encouraging Khalistani activities, which were a definite threat to India, as Canada has been doing these 40 years. And I think India got fed up, and I would not be at all surprised if some senior people in India decided to take some illegal action. This is not impossible. And Trudeau obviously went too far in denouncing India.
But where's the evidence of that, Terry? The whole point is your RCMP itself is saying that there's no proof of that.
Not exactly. No, I'm afraid there's been a mistake in what you've just said. What the RCMP commissioner said this morning, I've watched his statement carefully a couple of times. What he said this morning is that it's not happening now. He did not say it didn't happen before. This isn't a huge climb down by Canada to admit that we never had any evidence in the past of Indian wrongdoing in Canada. They're just saying...
But where is that evidence? I'm sure if they had evidence in the past, they would want to put it out, wouldn't they?
I'm sorry, I didn't say that again.
I'm saying he said there is no current illegal activity, and there's no proof of any activity having happened in the past as well. And if there was proof, I'm sure he would have put it out in the public domain.
He did not say that there was nothing that happened in the past. He's just saying it's not happening now. Both governments are trying to paper this over.
Let me just dig out that exact quote. Let me dig out the exact quote. But Veena Sikri, would you like to respond to that? He's saying Terry Milewski doesn't rule out the possibility that it could have happened. Since ties are on the make, perhaps that's why this statement has come out. Do you agree with that perception, Veena Sikri?
I don't agree with it at all, because we have always been asking for specific evidence of any proof, any evidence that India was involved in the past. And we never got that evidence from September 2023 onwards, the timeline when former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made the allegation in the Canadian Parliament. Ever since then, no proof, no evidence of any kind has been given to the Indian side about these so-called credible allegations. And if there had been, we would have talked about it, discussed it, examined it, all that would have happened, but nothing of the sort happened. And we know that because we've been waiting for that evidence for a long time. And I think there's a statement by the RCMP chief is very clear that yes, today nothing is happening, but by saying that he did not refer to the past maybe, but did not say that something was happening in the past either. I think out of respect to the former former prime minister and not, putting the lie to his statement in parliament. I think he was quite correct in his summation in the statement that he made. But I think that to say that this could have been happening in the past, then we would have expected proof of it. We would have expected something to come to our government. We would have expected our government to look at it, to give a rejoinder to it, and all of that. And we always knew from the very beginning, after the killing of Mr. Nijjar, that it was said to be an internal dispute within the Gurdwara. And the original conclusions, as we came to know from the RCMP at that time, these were the original conclusions, that it was an internal dispute. And then suddenly we have the statement that there's, the Indian government is involved, which was absolutely no proof. And we also know that this statement, the so-called credible allegations were discussed in the Five Eyes, and then it went on to America doing all of that. So all that is there in the past. We don't want to refer to the past. We don't want to dig up the past. We're very happy that the RCMP chief has concluded this and has made this statement, and we are extremely positive and satisfied that there's been this reset, and Prime Minister Mark Carney's visit was so successful, so strongly successful that the next 10 years, the pattern has been laid out for strongly mutually beneficial cooperation, and a new era has dawned in the relationship.
Dean Baxter, I'd also like you to bring in, comment on the point about the free run that the Khalistani elements were getting. That's perhaps the next step forward that Mr. Carney can take to show how serious he is about this, because these are individuals who've gone around, they've attacked places of worship, they've engaged in violent acts. How about cracking down on those individuals? Do you see that happening next?
Well, I guess this is a great question. I think Terry really brought this out in his book a number of years ago with respect to the lack of prosecutions by Canada, the fact that they had intelligence specifically linking Sikh separatism, Sikh terrorism, quite frankly, and had done nothing about it. This has been in the files with the RCMP and CSIS for 40-odd years. I spoke to, however, again, and to support Terry on his point, I spoke to two former CSIS analysts who were specifically assigned to the Asian desk, shall we say, and certainly Indian government and other governments have been involved with foreign influence operations as well as foreign. We won't go as far as saying interference, but many have. Certainly, the Chinese government has. This is a big problem. But yes, Canada needs to get past this. We need to reset relations. Period. And this is, from a diplomatic perspective, certainly doing that between Canada and India. But should Canada move forward on going after these terrorists? Yes, we have the IRGC who have assassinated a Canadian Iranian dissident not too long ago, and two were arrested. That's foreign interference, transnational oppression. And Mike Duhane said there's none of that happening in our country. So that's a problem. Reset with relations. We do need to go after people that are fundraising and propagating terrorists or interference operations in India through the Sikh community.
We have limited time, so I want to get in quick comments from Ruchi as well as Terry. Ruchi, quick action. What would you like to see the Canadian government take in terms of its positioning vis-a-vis these Khalistan elements? What can be done immediately?
Yes, I think we should take them seriously and, take them to the due course of law. And you know what, Shivam, diplomacy and law and order can happen at the same time. We didn't have to ruin our relationship with India because of these people, and we could have tackled the negative element there as well, like US did. US had an issue. They caught that Nikhil Gupta guy, but they were still progressing with the trade talks with India, and that is how Canada should have also done. But unfortunately, our leadership has been little, poor in that sense, and that should not have happened ever. And we should have taken it seriously. I mean, come on, they blew up a plane.
That's exactly the point, Terry. Because in the case of the United States, they had evidence. They went ahead, they prosecuted the person, but that didn't impact the ties. How about Canada?
Exactly.
Because Canada's case is unique, because you've had situations where there is still, a few years ago, entire floats with the assassination of our Prime Minister Indira Gandhi being depicted by a Khalistani terrorist. It gets as bizarre as that. And that's surely crossing the line of free speech somewhere.
Even,
Terry, please, let Terry come in.
Well, it certainly does cross the line, and I think that Canada should be much firmer about what is permitted and what is not. And the glorification, the public veneration as heroic martyrs of the Sikh nation of people who were directly involved in the Air India bombing, for example, as you call it, the Kanishka bombing, that's a disgrace. And no Canadian member of parliament or local politician should anymore attend these events where there are glorified posters garlanded with tinsel of Talvinder Singh Parmar, the mastermind of the Kanishka bombing. All of that should be boycotted by anyone in public life in Canada. But I want to emphasize just one point, and that is, before we go crazy saying, aha, this is a vindication of India, the Canadians have admitted they never had any evidence. No, they haven't. There's been no such admission. On the contrary, the case that you just referred to in the United States about the same plot run by the same suspects and aiming at the same targets in the US and in Canada, that was a conviction. The person who was running that plot has been convicted in New York. You can't say there's no evidence when it's been sufficient to cause the guy to plead guilty.
Well, all I can say is the RCMP says it doesn't have evidence. If it had the evidence, it can surely bring it out. They're under no compulsion to hide it under any law or perhaps within Canada itself. But let's leave it there. Certainly a positive development as far as India and Canada's ties are concerned. And we'll have to see how things develop from here on. Veena Sikri, Ruchi Wali, Dean Baxendale, Terry Milavsky, thanks so much for joining us this evening.